to the first webinar for 2015 as part of the AIMS Capability event series. This first webinar is about decision making under pressure, something I'm sure many of you have experienced. To give us just a little bit of an overview of how the session's going to run, I thought it might be useful to start with where there might be some problems, so some contingency planning. If you have any technical difficulties, please notice the number, the 1-800 number on your screen now, and jot that down. For some people, there may be a difference in the synchronisation from the audio and what you can see on the screen. And in part, that's because we're not yet all on the NBN, and because in some areas people have a lower bandwidth. Keep in mind that if you do have any difficulties, you've got two options. You can phone in, and you can also leave a text message for staff at Redback by using the small text box that you can now see on your screen down below on the left. So feel free to type in some messages there, and also use that box to type us comments or questions, because we can pick those up. Thank you to the people who have already sent in questions. We've taken some of the more popular ones and we have included them, and we'll attempt to address them when we can. The other thing that I just wanted to mention before we move on into the presentation proper is that if you do have real difficulties with the synchronisation, you can also listen via your landline. It's free, but it does mean that when we show the video that we're about to do so to start us off, you won't be able to hear that sound. Fear not though, because what I'm going to do is to actually summarise those main points for you, and also keep in mind if the whole thing does go belly up, you'll have the opportunity to see this again, because it is being recorded and it will be available on the AFAC site. Now, as you've seen, and thank you to all of the people who are here, we've had more than, I think, 460 registrations, so we're very chuffed about that. We've got some excellent presenters that you're going to hear as part of the session. They include both practitioners and researchers. Gavin Freeman from Tasmania Fire Service is with us, and researchers Peter Hayes and Lisa Fry. And I'm sure that many of you know and love their work in both incident management teams, simulation, and looking at cognition and metacognition. I'll also be saying a few things as well. So I think I've covered off the main points, and what I'd like you to do now is just sit back, relax, and watch the video which introduces decision making under pressure. Thank you.
The biggest incidents I've been involved in would be the ones of January in 2013 in Tasmania. People often refer to it as the Denali Fire, but it was a much larger event than that. We had to get messages out to communities in Denali and along the top end of the Tasman Peninsula. But because of the nature of the terrain and everything, we basically had to push people further down the peninsula. And there was another fire at the bottom of the peninsula. That was a lightning strike. That was overnight. So we had people that we were trying to move further down the peninsula to a town down there called Robina. And they were heading down the peninsula and they could see a column coming up from this fire that was south of them. And I just remember an awful lot of pressure of people sort of having a go at me, saying, how come you're evacuating people from the path of one fire into the path of another? And I spent a lot of time rerunning models over and over and over again on this fire right on the south, down at White Beach, basically to prove to people that we had to send all these holiday makers somewhere, and Nubina was the best spot, and that fire that was quite visibly close to Nubina was not going to turn around and suddenly start running toward them. It was also being pushed further south. you start to get to the point where you are doubting yourself a little bit, because you're not sure if you're making decisions so rapidly that you've actually made a decision on a completely erroneous piece of information, or you've actually missed something because you've got so much information that you just can't process it all simultaneously. And so when I think back, it's often all I can remember is almost feeling like I can feel the pressure again, and I can feel that squeeze, I can feel the headache, and I can just hear white noise. I just hear it as like just this white fuzz the whole time. It's like the really ordinary things can suddenly become really hard. Preparing a situation report that you would usually just knock up and push out in sort of 5 to 10 minutes or so, it suddenly becomes this epic effort of writing and report preparation. And so it's almost that mental fatigue starts to work across the work that you're doing.
When people actually have difficulty operating under pressure, there are sort of two things that we see quite commonly. One is that what I describe as getting stuck, which is sort of a fixation sort of error, where people are either focusing on the ground truth, what's happening here and now, but can't see the big picture and what's going to happen next. So in that case, people get a form of tunnel vision, and they're really honing in on one element of the situation or the decision or the action, and are a little bit oblivious. There's a blind spot to other areas of what's going on. But you can get the opposite as well, where we have what we've been describing as a fibrillation error, where people are chopping and changing their attention so often that they really don't get anything done. So they're busy working out, what's going to happen next and what's the big picture, but forgot that there's actually a truck in a difficult position or whatever. Cognition is thinking processes, and metacognition is being able to understand and manage your thinking. So it's knowing that we have some performance limits in our intellectual hardware, but we can actually do something about it. What I observe experienced people doing is actually giving themselves what I would call thinking space. So people who get trapped in that fibrillation or fixation, one way is to actually change the focus. So for example, if people are looking at ground truths and what's happening right now, you can almost physically see them take that step back and start looking at the big picture and what's going to happen next.
If you find yourself feeling that sort of that pressure that you're losing a bit of control, it might be because you actually are, and you're focusing on something tactical rather than pulling back and becoming more strategic. You walk into noise everywhere, chaos, lots of scribbling on maps and lots of hammering keyboards, and but not much coming out the other side. And that's where it's hard to do, particularly when a fire's running hard outside, to say stop, we've got to stop everything. We're not being productive here, let's calm down, let's work out what it is our objectives are and who's going to, what role each person's going to take in that, and it's effective, it works.
From my perspective, I'm looking at what that might mean for training and for people learning, not just in classrooms but on the job, particularly people who are in coaching and mentoring relationships, where you're actually following someone, trying to learn how they do their job and how you could do it, and how you could make decisions under pressure. And again, I'd come back to understanding what those decision trade-offs are in context and in an operational environment, and working out then how you're going to manage your thinking processes in that same sort of situation.
Okay, so there you have it from the practitioners themselves, what some of the key pressures feel like when they're under the pump, when you're under the pump. For those people who might not have been able to see the video, we heard from Sandy White. Sandy White was the fire behaviour analyst in the Dunalley fires, and she was needing to run fire models because she needed to work out where to evacuate people to, and at that time there was actually another fire that was happening. She spoke about the headache, the white noise and the squeeze, and the need to continue to rerun those models, not just to reassure herself that she hadn't missed anything, but to reassure others as well. We've heard also from Lisa Fry, and Lisa is with us and she's going to talk a little bit later in this webinar. She talked about the kinds of errors that people make, one called fixation and the other fibrillation. I won't go into them too much more now because you will be hearing from her. We also heard from Gavin Freeman, and Gavin is going to join me very shortly, and he is going to tell us a little bit more about some of those pressures. But in the video, he was talking about sometimes the need to actually ask people to stop and take stock because they're not being productive. So, Gavin, are you there? Great, okay, it works. Technology, it's wonderful. Thank you for your comments, both in the video as well as being able to spend some time with us today. I'm imagining that you've had your fair share of pressure situations. I know that you were the incident controller for the Maya fire in Hobart, for example, and a number of others. I'm wondering, from your point of view, if you think that there was anything that hasn't yet been mentioned in that video about the elements of making decisions under pressure.
Yeah, look, obviously, Sandy particularly put it very well, and there's a lot of obvious pressures that come from that dynamic developing situation when fires or incidents are running out of control. But there's probably a couple of things I could add, and one that's become very apparent for me over the years as you transition from the field to working in control centres, and as an incident controller or a state controller, you know to a large degree what some of these people are going through out there in the field in combating the incident. And I've personally experienced situations where in very large incidents that have been going for long periods of time, resource intensive, you just know that sometimes you're burning your people out, and you've got very little option about that sometimes as well, because the job just has to be done. So as a leader and as a commander, knowingly having that sort of effect on your people is a very tough situation to be in. It's very hard to defend, and it's very difficult to address. And probably another thing, if I could add, Chris, another pressure that I believe is having a real effect on our incident controllers in particular, is that nagging thought that can come into the back of your mind that is there going to be an inquiry, a coronial or a Royal Commission about this job, and will the decisions I'm making now be picked apart with someone that has the benefit of time and space to acquire hindsight. So I think that there are a couple of things that weren't particularly covered, but are real stresses on commanders.
Okay, well, that's actually really very interesting that you've made that point, because we've actually had a question that's been sent in. It was sent in by a participant ahead of the schedule, and again, I'll just remind people that they can add comments or give us some questions by using that text box. But this question that came in ahead of schedule, and I'll paraphrase it because it was a little bit long, but it said something like, what is the consequence, so from your point of view, what is the consequence of inquiries that focus on headhunting after the event? This must play in the back of the minds of individuals in these high-end positions. And the participant notes that, and I quote, my observations are that people will go into a comfort zone and potentially not make a decision or rely on a black and white tick-the-box type of process to hide behind, even if they know the decision is wrong. And he or she is wondering if the organisation, I guess their concern is that they're wondering if the organisation is going to hang them out to dry as a sacrificial lamb. What are your thoughts or comments on that?
Yeah, as I said, I think that sort of thinking is a real stressor that perhaps wasn't apparent in the minds of our key leadership people before. And it makes me wonder if it changes our decision-making to more of a conservative, rules-based approach, which I think is what the person that's posed the question is saying, away from that intuitive decision-making that experienced leaders can and do make. So, I think that's there, but I think we've got to challenge that. We've got to deal with that. And I think we can do that by ensuring we dedicate even more resources than we've done in the past to develop test procedures and plans and practice them in as close to real-time simulation as we possibly can to ensure they're watertight. I know it's easy to say this because we all know, those of us who have experienced incidents and experienced incident commanders, you know that there's always that one around the corner where you encounter an element of the incident that we haven't come across before necessarily. And in those times, as commanders, we just need to make decisions. And I think the key thing for us as incident managers is to accept that from time to time, we'll look back and say, we could have done it differently under different situations. And perhaps our real challenge for all of us in our organisations is to convince the community and those of us that will judge us that that's the case, that we're not going to get it perfectly right every time. And with the benefit of hindsight, they'll always identify another way to do it. But it's really about the outcomes we need to focus on, I think.
And I think those are actually really important points in thinking about how do we support people who are making these decisions at the time, and how might we be able to provide better kind of frameworks or metrics that aren't built on some kind of imagined way that this ought to happen, which is wonderful with the benefit of 2020 hindsight. Do you have any other comments at this point?
No, I think I'll leave it there for now. Christine?
Yep, okay, fantastic, thank you. What we're also interested in hearing and getting some feedback at this point from you is in relation to, for the people who are on the line, and we can see the names of you there, could you provide us with your sense of your own experience? And there's a poll coming up now, and so the question here is, how much do you think you understand about making decisions under pressure? Can you have a go at that, please? It's changing. Give it another couple of seconds. Oh, well, still coming. Okay, fantastic. I know that you too can see that particular poll, so we'll leave it there. Clearly, we have a range of experience in the webinar, and people think they know a little and a fair bit, and we'll also hear about why that might be the case in terms of people's different levels of expertise later on. So thank you so much for that. For the next part of our webinar, we're going to hear from Peter Hayes. Now, Peter has enormous experience both as a practitioner in fire, land management agencies, as well as having turned his hand to doing a PhD. And Peter has done a lot of work in looking at decision making in incident management teams, and he's going to start us off with the presentation part and talk about why making decisions becomes so challenging sometimes, and also provide an outline of the various approaches that people typically use when they make decisions. So over to you, Peter.
Yeah, thank you very much, Christine. Yeah, good afternoon. There's a variety of factors. I better flick on the slide first. Here we go. Okay, yes, there's a variety of factors that create demanding situations for decision makers. I suppose the first is the context and the environment. And we know that the nature of an incident demands that IMTs, or incident management teams, perform quickly and shapes the type of information that they can use to make decisions. The information in an incident is often uncertain and incomplete, and in some cases there is either little information or in others, perhaps a vast amount of information. And of course, the situation continues to change. Three types of human factors affect our performance in incident management settings, namely thinking, or we call it cognition, relating, and coordinating. And as decision makers, we have limits to how much information we can deal with and how effectively we can use it. And of course, it's not just ourselves we're managing. We have colleagues and team members with whom we need to interact with and coordinate our actions. Rasmussen developed a really useful framework to think about cognitive performance, observing that individuals tend to operate in three modes, namely skill, rule, and knowledge-based. This framework highlights that skill performance requires the least effort and it is fast and efficient. At the other end of the spectrum, knowledge-based decisions are much more effortful and slower. And between these two types of performance is rule-based. For any given incident management team personnel will need to use at least two, if not all three, of these modes. The type of performance depends largely on how routine or novel the incident is, and how skill and experience the team or the person is. Most of you will be aware that there's a variety of frameworks that we can use to describe decision making. In essence, these frameworks can be sorted into three different types. The first is normative, and it tells us how we should make decisions. For example, a cost-benefit analysis of the various options. The second is prescriptive, and this helps us to train or guide people to make better decisions. And perhaps the easiest examples are SOPs, or standard operating procedures and protocols. And lastly, it's what we call descriptive. So descriptive frameworks are based on how people actually make decisions. For example, the size up of an incident as the first unit approaches a scene. Based on previous experience, the responding officer will categorise the situation and identify what additional resources may be required. The first model I'm going to talk a little bit more about is what we call a rational or analytical model, and this is also described as a normative model. These approaches assume that there's an optimal or a correct choice, and that the performance of the decision maker can be assessed by comparing the utility of the actual decision to the optimal decision. The key assumption here is that the decision maker has enough time and opportunity to carefully evaluate all options. Clearly, this is not the case during the escalating phase of an incident. From the 1950s onwards, it became clear that actual decision-making behaviour was actually not particularly rational.
We're back. I need to come back on now. Thank you. Thank you for that, Peter. That was a terrific introduction, and in part we're wanting to make this webinar as interactive as we possibly can. And I know how busy people are, and what typically happens at this point is that people have been multitasking. You've possibly put the webinar up in the right-hand corner of your screen so that you can get on with typing some emails. Right now we need you to focus your full attention here, and we've got another polling question for you which will be useful information for us for the next half of Peter's presentation. So here we have one, and it says, how much do you think you know about recognition primed decision making? This is a word that's often floated about. The question is, how aware are you about the elements of it and how it might connect with things like biases and another word, heuristics, which Peter is going to introduce to us. Okay. Interesting. Well, Peter, Justin, I know that they're still coming in, but there are a lot of people who haven't heard of recognition primed decision making, or perhaps might have heard another colleague use it, but aren't that familiar with it themselves, and some others who have a little bit of understanding, but not so many people who have a lot. So we might pause and create a snapshot of that polling question there at that point, and I'll hand back to Peter and back to the second part of his presentation, decision-making concepts, to tell us what do elements like heuristics, biases and recognition primed decision-making have to offer. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Christine. Okay, the second type of decision making I'd like to discuss is heuristics and biases. These are actually often used to explain why decision making is often not strictly rational. A heuristic is a mental shortcut or rule of thumb that we use to help our decision making. A common example that firefighters use is fighting the fire you have got rather than the fire you might have. This could be described as an example of bounded rationality. In simple terms, we're trying to get the decision maker to focus on just what is important at the moment. Heuristics are a form of decision-making bias that generally help us, but sometimes they can hinder decision making. By relying on heuristics, we are trading off thoroughness to make decisions quickly. Research conducted by Jim McLennan with small fire units show that effective incident commanders carefully use a small number of heuristics to help guide their decision making. One of the examples McLennan talks about is what we call mini-maxing. Very often, particularly in the escalating or initial phase of an incident when it may not be clear what exactly is going on, a decision maker might select a course of action that is least likely to lead to a worse outcome. Naturalistic decision making is based actually on what decision makers actually do. And if you look at the top right of the slide, you'll see an image of a footy match. And you can imagine that a referee is on the basis of even less than a second of play is making decisions about whether a tackle is high, too low, whether someone's offside, or whatever it may be, the rules might be of the game. And they're actually doing that based on extensive experience. They've seen thousands of tackles, and that helps them make some decisions about whether the tackle was appropriate or not. So there's two, these approaches are often described as intuitive decision-making approaches, and there's two important features. First, rather than choosing how to choose between two different options, naturalistic approaches focus on the appropriate assessment and categorization of the situation. Whilst a novice decision maker tend to rely on their reasoning skills, in other words, if you think about the Rasmussen slide, the knowledge-based approach, very conscious and effortful, an expert or very skilled decision maker bases their reasoning on bases their decision on their ability to assess the situation. And this is largely skill or rule-based, and so is more efficient. The other point to make is that naturalistic decision making tend to occur in cycles. We tend to think a little bit, act a bit, evaluate the outcomes, and act some more. And very often it's the feedback from our decisions or the effect of our decisions that actually helps us refine or change the next decisions we make. Perhaps the best known naturalistic decision-making framework is recognition prime decision, which you were just polled on. The simplest version of this is what we call a simple match. In essence, this is where a decision maker identifies a decision as similar to an event they have seen before, and then applies the same or perhaps a similar approach to resolve or manage the incident or the event. We know that recognitional strategies are heavily used for critical decisions in IMTs. The last slide I'm going to present in this part of the presentation is just highlighting the difference between team versus individual decision processes. So far, the decision frameworks we've discussed were developed for an individual decision maker rather than a team. And we know that incident managers need to harness the joint abilities of a variety of personnel. And moreover, different functional areas within an IMT focus on different time and spatial scales. IMTs rely on what we call distributed decision making. The term distributed highlights that no one team member usually has a complete understanding of the situation. and a variety of personnel are actually involved in actually making decisions and conducting analysis important in resolving the incident. The requirement to work as a team adds a further challenge to effective decision making. The two circles shown in the initial human factor slides highlighted that relating and coordinating are very important features. So the team can interact effectively, coordinate their activities, and coordinate their analysis and decision making. And obviously, this can be very, very difficult to achieve in an incident management setting. Dr. Owen will talk a little bit more about this. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Peter. Again, I think it's a useful introduction to some of the key elements. We do have a question here that I'll just ask you that's come in, if you could answer it briefly. And it's about, and I quote, would preformed IMTs assist with better decision making due to the two members working and training with each other on numerous occasions? That's been an area of yours in terms of your PhD. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I suppose my initial reaction, Christine, is that the preformed teams generally are a little better, a little more coordinated, and thus a little more efficient in how they handle their analysis and their decision making. And that efficiency tends to mean they can make decisions more quickly and hopefully on a more timely basis. So generally, that preformedness or that familiarity is likely to assist them in being a little more efficient in their decision making.
Thank you for that. Well, now, as Peter said, my area is one that has looked at team decision making and leadership in incident management teams. And I'm just going to share very briefly some of the key findings from that. And I just also wanted to alert you to the fact that these slides will be available for you afterwards. So if I could have my slides up now, that would be, I am starting with a polling question. And in this case, it's again asking you for your feedback about whenever you might have been involved in a pressure situation, what might you have experienced? And I did see it, there it is. So have you ever been part of an emergency event where you were, and you can choose more than one answer, narrowing your focus, becoming scattered in your thinking, not able to pull back and look at the big picture, seeming to make more mistakes and starting to forget things? So we'll give that a couple of seconds to run. Okay, just a couple more seconds. Okay, that looks like it's pretty stable, so thank you for that. We'll take a snapshot of it. But interestingly, because all of these things that are listed there are casualties and start to emerge when people are under stress, so they're the impacts of stress in a situation. Sometimes that stress can be as a result of fatigue or of a situation that is getting out of control. And so I want to share with you some ideas about leadership and teamwork under pressure and the importance of the communication imperative. Now, because one of the first casualties when people are under pressure, when they might be fatigued and or feeling stressed, is this idea about situation awareness. And Peter talked about distributed situation awareness, and that the only way you will get effective situation awareness individually and in a team is if people are communicating effectively and are pooling their knowledge. And the role under those circumstances of the leader is to establish the background conditions to enable that to happen. Also important to point out and to be able to distinguish between professional expertise and situational expertise. They're not the same thing in an event that might be dynamic, novel, and unfolding at a particular rapid rate. The only way you will gain situational expertise is if people in a team are actually being effective in the way they're sharing information. We can look at some pretty spectacular failures of communication and coordination, and we can notice certain things about the patterns of communication in those teams. When people get stressed, fatigued, under pressure, they typically look inwards, they start focusing on their own tasks and lose sight of what it is that other people might be wanting from them. Under those circumstances, particularly in military, uniform or hierarchical cultures, communication can typically shut down. This then allows weak signals not to be detected or, if they are, perhaps to remain unsaid. Sometimes it even means that groupthink occurs, which is when people might not be willing to question or test the dominant ideology or view of the group or the leader. And when those things start to happen, we get migration towards unsafe boundaries and major mistakes and accidents happening. Similarly, when we look at successful teams, we notice a different kind of communication pattern, but a pattern we can identify. And in those teams, people are very effective in being able to share different kinds of viewpoints. They have really good ways of sharing critical information, creating information-rich conditions. And again, if you think about the role of a leader, and a leader might not be an IC, it might be a planning officer or a situation unit leader, for example. Under those circumstances, it's the way in which the tone is set for how people might raise concerns or questions, how they might assess alternative perspectives, how they might be constantly engaging in a what's missing kind of thinking pattern. And in doing so, they're not only being really clear in the way that they're managing their own expectations and the expectations of others, but they're also monitoring themselves and others for signs of stress and fatigue, and then doing something about that, not just leaving it, but actually managing. And you do well to be thinking about how in the next event you might be able to be sharing some of those communication skills. I know from my own work in looking at effective incident controllers, they've typically engaged in three patterns of communication. And in doing so, they've been very active in giving feedback to their team members and in some respects coaching those team members. There's a concern for boundary riding, which is making sure that the team is in alignment in time with where the event is and able to meet expectations about managing that particular event, thinking about ahead in terms of the future. There's a concern about making sure that there's an integration within the team, that the pressure hasn't led to stovepipes or silos that can sometimes evolve. And there's also a concern to look outwards at making sure that the team's work is aligning with the expectations of other teams in an emergency management system. I won't dwell on this too much, and as I said, the slides will be available for you, but knowing how challenging it can sometimes be when under pressure and in hierarchical cultures, we've done some work in workshops looking at how people can raise a concern with another and how they might establish a graded warning protocol. And what I've done is I've asked people to think about an exercise when they have experienced this awkward moment and they've not been sure about how to raise something. And in doing so, what they've then done is to consider, what does that, who does that actually relate to? So I've looked at these things that I've collected up and have done some analysis on them. And it's quite interesting because most of the most of the work has been, or concerns for people, has actually been about followers managing up, trying to get to speak truth to power, rather than most of the concerns in terms of leaders trying to get subordinates or followers to do something. And there's when I looked at that in a little bit more detail, when leaders are trying to get followers to do something, they're then attempting to actually overcome some inertia that people seem to have frozen, and Lisa Fry is going to talk a little bit about what can sometimes happen under those circumstances. What's also really interesting, and given that most of the concerns people were expressing in these exercises was about truth to power, speaking up, that in many respects it's actually about trying to get a follower to get a leader to actually stop doing something and take notice of something that might be going on. And Carl White refers to the term dysfunctional momentum, and Mary Omedy has referred to sunk cost, which is basically when everybody's or a leader might have invested significantly in a course of action, but fundamentally it's not working. So I think there's some insights here that is incumbent upon both team members as well as leaders to make sure that they're able to provide the right kind of climate for people and to consider ways in which people might be able to share stuff that might not necessarily be palatable and what that might mean, and to do that ahead of time rather than in a crisis situation. There are some strategies up on this slide that are worth thinking about, particularly under stressful situations. Under those situations, memory becomes increasingly important, and memory aids under these circumstances become something that's useful to use because memory becomes compromised. And think again about how you might be making sure people are getting some rest, even hydration, how the workload is managed, where might the clicks be, what might the body language be telling you, because those things are particularly important as well. Now I'm going to put my final slide on, and in a moment I'm going to ask Lisa Fry to talk about her work. But I've just noticed that there's a question that has come in, I think, around a concern about boundary writing potentially being confused as micromanaging. And I've certainly seen lots of cases where people do start to get buried in the weeds, and in part because people then are starting to feel comfortable doing the job of somebody else rather than in taking on their own responsibility. And it is very important that leaders are establishing those conditions for people to be able to get on and do their work effectively, and that boundary writing under those circumstances might not be about writing the individual, but writing around the various elements of the environment and making sure that people are keeping up to speed, knowing that a situation report is due, and giving people time to be thinking about that, helping prepare them for a teleconference that might be about to happen, and helping that person who might be starting to feel under pressure to be able to anticipate what's going on. So that's what boundary writing is actually about. Now, another polling question for you. You can't kind of get too many emails done here. This leads us into Lisa Fry's work, because what she's been looking at is the differences between experts and novices in how they think about things and the kinds of strategies that they use. So the question here is, who has been involved in a high-pressure decision-making environment and observed really good at it that actually made it look easy? Tell us what you think about that. Okay, just about stable there. So lots of people have seen that, some haven't. And I'm calling on Lisa to come forward at this point because she's going to explain why this might be the case and what we can learn from some of her work in relation to it. So over to you, Lisa.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Chris. Just get the slides up there. Yeah, basically my research was looking at when people are in high stress or high cognitive load conditions, how they actually manage to keep their thinking on track. So the research was around metacognition, and cognition is thinking, metacognition is how you manage your thinking, and one of the best places to observe that is in very high stress situations. Oddly enough, if you ask a lot of emergency management responders about stress, you don't get much of an answer. Sometimes they seem resistant to the idea of being under stress, but you can see from the types of language that they use when you interview that there's a lot of physical and emotional responses during an emergency response. It's sort of built in, and it's the body's way of becoming alert and ready for action. People will be familiar with the idea of the adrenaline start pumping. In fact, many of the people listening today would have had that experience of feeling the adrenaline pumping in their ears. Sometimes that's actually really good. It helps to focus your attention and gears you up for action. But at other times it can actually be a little bit paralysing, and people have limits to the amount of cognitive work that they can do when they're in that situation. So what I'm interested in is when people manage to do it really well, what is it that they're actually doing, and is it something that we can teach to other people? So metacognition, as I said, is being able to keep your thinking on track. And one of the things that you notice with novices is that that's much more effortful, and particularly knowing what to pay attention to seems quite effortful. But really skilled decision makers, they seem to be able to remain calm under pressure, and they can keep themselves and also the team functioning. So even when there's a lot of information coming in, when there's a lot of competing priorities, they seem to be able to work their way through it, and also to supervise and lead others who need to work their way through it. They don't sort of lose the plot, and they don't sort of mentally disengage. They manage to be able to prioritise things. It's a real skill, mainly because emergency response often has competing cognitive demands. So if it was simple, the answer to most decisions would be really obvious. You'd just be able to follow an SOP or to choose A or B, and you'd be done. But what happens in emergency response is you often get demands that compete with each other, and they're often directly opposed to each other. But when you watch a skilled decision maker, they can actually make that look easy. So when you have someone who's not skilled, the types of things, I'll call them blind spots. I don't really like the word errors, because we can get very skilled people who experience all of these things. In a research environment, it's really easy to induce high cognitive load, and even the most skilled people will succumb to these errors if we wanted to go that far. But you see it really quickly amongst novices, and it's things like focusing on what's happening right in front of you but losing sight of the bigger picture, or the other way around as well, where people are focused on the big picture and missing some of the ground truths. There's also a temporal element, so being able to focus on different time scales, so what's happening right now and what's going to happen next. Focusing on situational awareness, and a lot of people will be familiar with the term analysis paralysis. So sometimes people are so busy building up a perfect picture of the situation that they really miss the opportunity to make decisions that could get things done. And the opposite happens too, where people fail to sum up the situation and get proper situational awareness, and they can actually go off and make decisions without the right information. Again, it's really easy to do, and it's not just something that novices do, but these are the sorts of challenges. Another one is being able to decide what the goals are, and knowing when to change plans and change goals. Another one is accepting responsibility. So, you know, really balancing between micromanaging and deferring decisions to others and taking work on yourself. And then a really big one is about focus on safety. So we know that most states in Australia have safety and the protection of life and property often in their value statement for their agencies. So we know that safety is really important, but often what happens is you have competing demands around safety, and being able to focus on the right ones at the right time can be quite challenging. So I'll just go through what the patterns look like, and I don't want to spend too much time. These slides are all available on the webinar, and they're also in the book that Chris will talk about. But basically what you see a really skilled person doing is having a bit of cognitive flexibility, so they don't get locked in to one aspect of the situation, and they move through a cycle in their decision making. So they don't get perfect situational awareness, then make a perfect decision, and then implement a perfect action. In emergency response, you rarely have the time for that. So what you see them doing is going through a cycle of decision making where they sum up the situation, they make some decisions, they implement something, and then they reassess the situation, and it sort of evolves like that. It's complicated because you have distributed decision making amongst teams, so communication becomes really important. But you can see in some of this research data that there are real competing priorities, and you're really trying to consider all of this stuff at the same time often. So the first one obviously is around situational awareness. Then we talk about decisions, so being able to make decisions, and in here a really key issue is time and motion. So in this type of research, what you hear experienced and inexperienced people talk about all the time is the time and motion issues. If you didn't have time pressures, you could just work your way through things. You could go and grab an SOP, work out which is the best one. So time is critical. The other one is around the competing goals. Now on this particular slide, I call it containment property, but in other contexts, it's really the difference between an offensive goal and a defensive goal. So another example is where, people are doing a planned burn, for example, and so the offensive goal is to put fire into the landscape. At some point, if we're unlucky, it may actually turn into a bushfire, and then you've got a defensive goal of trying to contain it. So knowing where the trigger point is between those offensive goals and defensive goals is really a key skill for people who are good at this type of work. In terms of implementing action, a really key part of this that you hear people talk about is managing risks and responsibilities, whose job it is to do what. And also, people get very cognitively overloaded if they take on everything themselves, but then sometimes it requires a level of trust to be able to delegate or to escalate issues. And beyond that, it may be that you simply don't have enough people to escalate or delegate things to. So this actually creates time pressures and it creates resource pressures. And the place where you see this most is when people describe a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. So if you ever hear people talk about damned if you do, damned if you don't, listen carefully, because that will tell you really where these decision trade-offs are, where they're not able to make a perfect decision. They have to choose between imperfect options. In terms of what does this tell us and what can we do with this information, I guess my interest is in working out, when we watch someone who does this really well, who can operate really well under pressure, how can we actually take that skill and teach it to other people, to novices? And one way obviously is to give people experience, but I think dumping them in the deep end is probably not the best strategy. So there's got to be a way of actually working with an experienced or a skilled person and learning how it is that they manage their thinking. And the reason that these types of thinking skills are difficult to teach in a classroom is because they really rely on context. So, for example, the answer to all of the questions on this slide is it depends. It really depends on the context and the situation. So what we want people to learn is how to calibrate where they focus their attention, calibrate it to the situation at hand. And also when people say they've got a gut feel for things, which you do often hear in the research, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're inventing a procedure on the fly or they're making something up. Often it means they've got a gut feel for what they need to pay attention to and which particular procedure they're going to whip out at that particular point in time. So Chris, I'll leave it there.
Come back. Fantastic, thank you so much for that. That was a really insightful introduction to some of the key things that practitioners make, skilled decision makers, as you say. And I know that we had discussed an early question that had come in about recognition prime decision making. I am though looking at the time. So what I'm proposing at this point is that we move immediately into Peter's final presentation. So if that can come up, please. He's going to talk about some strategies that can be used to help in decision making. And if we have some time, and we know that people do need to leave at 1:30, but if we have some time, then we'll have a panel and also discuss a couple of other questions that have come in. So over to you, Peter. Can we get Peter's screen up? Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Christine.
Over to you.
Yeah, I'll try and keep this fairly short to the point. There's lots of approaches we can use. Lots of approaches we can use to improve our ability to make sound decisions, and these include thinking strategies, some of which Lisa pointed to, but also things like worst-case scenarios and tools such as risk management frameworks, predictive models, and aide-memoirs. If we think back to Rasmussen's skill, rule, knowledge framework for cognitive performance, we can see that our ability to quickly generate decisions using these particular tools will depend on how well practiced we are in using these tools. And moreover, whether we are striving for speed or efficiency versus accuracy. Now, in essence, how these decision aids work is through 5 or 6 main mechanisms. Firstly, they reduce the load on our memory, and as we've discovered, that's an important criteria for us to perform well. Secondly, they improve the accuracy of important information. Thirdly, they actually reduce the cognitive workload, speed our prediction, and enable analysis of options. So in essence, they're allowing us to bring more analytical techniques into an incident management setting. They can enable us to harness expertise of the team, important and distributed decision making, reduce some of our biases, and improve our ability to think clearly. Now, my last slide here is just trying to summarise a little bit of what we've covered today. Perhaps the first point to make is that the time available and what is at risk influences or shapes the type of decision making that's most appropriate. There's obviously no benefit in undertaking an analytic cost-benefit approach if decisions need to be made very quickly. A further point to make is that the skills and experience of an incident management team will affect their decision-making repertoire. The creative and analytical approaches shown in the diagram require ample time, and in the case of analytical decision-making, this is likely to be thorough and generate sound decisions that can be justified. However, these creative and analytical approaches are also cognitively demanding and limit what else team members can do. The rule-based approaches can be based on heuristics or on standard operating procedures and protocols. These are efficient approaches that are suitable for dynamic environments. Of course, the rules selected need to be appropriate to the circumstances, and occasionally heuristics can lead to unintended consequences. The recognition prime decisions are excellent for time-constrained dynamic situations such as incident management. US research shows that about 72% of the critical decisions made in wildfire IMTs were actually recognition-based. However, recognition prime decisions require significant skill and experience. In some instances, recognition prime decisions may be more difficult to justify. So summing up, the context, the phase of the incident, and the skill and the experience of the team will shape the type of decision-making used. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for that. And I think it's interesting because it's brought us back to some of the tensions around the difference between analytical and recognition prime decision making. Well, we're back. If we can now have all of our presenters on the screen. And to you out there, we know that we look like the Brady Bunch, so, you know, I can come say hello. Hello. And we've got a question that I'd just like to first start off putting to Gavin, and it picks up on Peter's final point. And the question that has come in is, do you believe that recognition-primed decision makers, that is the Rona Flynn model, make better leaders in time-critical decisions than those who try and analyse all of the data and modelling? In other words, those who rely on their gut instinct, having drawn on personal experiences rather than those who evaluate all the options. So, Gavin, what are your thoughts on that as a way of starting to close off the webinar? Oh, he's mute. You're on mute, I think.
Mute. We'll try that. How's that? Sound better?
Thank you.
Yeah. Now, look, I think that can be debated backwards and forwards a lot, but my personal opinion is I think they do. I think under time-critical situations, your people are looking for you to make a decision. Sometimes just any decision will do. In the words of Corporal Jones, don't panic, Mr. Mannering. Just you don't have to necessarily rely on just at that instant recalling things that you've experienced, I guess, too, because one of the key things for leaders is having your command intent pre-established and understood. That always gives your people and you as a commander a backstop and gives you that framework that will guide decision making as well. Having said that, you know that sometimes there's going to be some complex or unforeseen elements that require a quick decision to be made, and that has to be done. Without experience, it's going to be a lot tougher, but those calls have to be made sometimes.
Okay, great, thank you. Peter, Lisa, do you have any thoughts?
Hi, good.
Peter?
Yeah, I just got to make a comment. I think Gavin's touched on an important issue, and that's, speed is often of the essence, and thus recognition primes, almost required in some way if you want to, probably get a better result. We've got limited processing capability, so if you can use recognition, which is kind of a skill or rule-based decision making, that's going to actually free up your ability to manage the team and other aspects of the incident as well. So the great advantage it conveys is the ability to probably do more in less time. So it's generally probably going to be more effective or more efficient. I think yesterday when we were talking, Lisa made a nice observation she might want to talk about omission or commission, what we can do versus what we may not do, and Lisa might want to talk about that now.
Yeah, sure. Basically, the essence of that is the reason that you often have a decision trade-off is because you're really trying to guard against two different types of mistakes or traps or blind spots. And one is you're trying to guard against an error of commission, which is where you make a decision or you take an action and it results in a mistake and it turns out badly. So sometimes people will hesitate to make decisions because they don't want to make a mistake. But you could then run the risk of the opposite, which is making an error of omission, which is you've missed an opportunity to make decisions, because a lot of the decisions in emergency management are quite time-bound. So that's the difference there. That's why there's a trade-off.
Okay, fantastic for that. Given the time, I'm going to ask for Gavin and myself to just stay on the screens at the moment. There's a final webinar question that we'd just like to pose to you, and then I'll hand over to Gavin for some closing comments. And we've got Peter rather than Gavin. So at the moment, if we could bring up the polling question and then sort out the screen. The polling question, for those of you who might be wondering what it is before it comes up, is to ask you, how much do you think you now understand about making decisions under pressure? So leave that one with you for now. It will come up at some point, and I'll hand over to Gavin to just make some closing comments.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. There's some really good points come up through the webinar there, but it just reinforced for me about the team approach we need to take. And just remember, as an incident controller, you're not really managing the incident, you're managing the team that manages the incident. So you need to make sure that team's fully engaged and supported all the way through. Set your command intent and support them to do the job, and just remember it's not all about you. I think being a leader in emergency management is a tough job. It takes a different kind of person, and I actually haven't met one yet that steps into those key command roles for accolades. So I think you have to be at peace with yourself and know it's okay to not get it perfectly right every time. if you can walk away knowing in your heart that you've done everything that you possibly can to keep your responders, first of all, and the community safe, well, that's a pretty good result. But we have to acknowledge that sometimes people will be hurt. Unfortunately, sometimes people will die. But if we let that skew our thinking to the point where we become hesitant of undertaking the role or hesitant of taking those tough decisions, well, then I think we're failing in our duty.
Okay. Yeah, very, very well said. Thank you so much. All right, well, this brings to a close this particular webinar. Up on the screen very shortly will be some thank you notes to you. And when you do log out from this, you will be asked another half a dozen questions. I promise it will only take a couple of minutes. And if you are able to give us some feedback about how you found this, we would love to hear from you. And there's a small gift as a result of doing that, and it has something to do with the resource guide that has been the basis for this work. So thank you so much for bearing with us. And we hope that you've managed to get something out of it. And there will be some more webinars and some other professional development series. Have a look at the AFAC website. And until then, over and out. Goodbye.